Hello and welcome everybody to the Mono Retro Wave Game Kit. I'm your host Pixel Hustler, and I'm going to give you a quick little tour of all the elements that we've got to play with here. Now, one of the first things that we're going to want to do in creating a game is we're going to want to create our space. In particular for this obstacle course game kit, we've got a bunch of blocks that basically are just elements to start constructing an obstacle course race that we can start implementing our interactive and animated items into. So you can just grab these, resize them, you can reskin them to a completely different theme if you want, or you can just drag and drop them and place them wherever you need to in order to start constructing a space for your character, start playing around and walking around in. Now, one of the first things we're going to want to do in our race is we're going to have a start gate, and we're going to have a timer. Now, the basis of most interaction, or a lot of really important interaction, is basically a trigger object that when you interact with it or step on it, move into it or whatever, it's going to trigger an animation on its own object or in another object. So for example, in this instance, we've got our start gate, and if we walk into our trigger object right here, it's going to start the animation in our gate, and it's going to open the gate. And once we walk through it, you see the timer just automatically starts running. If we keep going, we've got a little end block here. If we walk through that, it's going to stop the timer. So you can position all these elements wherever it is you need them for your start and end of your obstacle course, and wherever it is that you like to stick your timer at. Now, we're going to move on to some animated objects and a respawn. Every game is going to require some sort of respawning, right? So the character falls off the ledge, it respawns at a particular checkpoint. It gets knocked off by the moving platform or the pendulum trap or something like that, or an enemy touches it, you're going to respawn to the last checkpoint, generally speaking. So we've got our respawn element here that you can just drag and drop and place wherever you need it. Now, in looking at this space, the way to think about it is that these yellow objects and these transparent bluish objects are the objects that either trigger an action or where an event takes place. So if you look off in the distance there, you see the super jump power up. That bluish transparent space is where the player is able to actually execute the super jump. That effect will apply when they're in that space. And in this instance, with the respawn, the bluish trigger object here is essentially using the Mono Warp, which if I walk onto it, basically makes me respawn where this yellow object is. That's my spawn point in this instance for this element. So again, if I walk into it, it warps me, teleports me to the spawn point, the yellow object right there. Now that respawn is basically what I'm using in all of these hazards and traps, as they're called in gaming. So one thing to note is that interactivity is not all about coded interactions. Even if you're using no-code tools, there is coding happening in the background, but coding is not necessary. I mean, you know, it's very helpful and it definitely goes a long way, but you can also incorporate animated objects that act as interactive elements. So for example, again, all of these animated hazards and traps are using the respawn point. So you can see I've got the respawn trigger using the Mono Warp on the floor here, and it respawns me to my respawn point right there. So, you know what, let me just go have some fun and try to get over here. And we'll just get knocked down just to demonstrate, and then we respawn. So same thing with the moving platform, and I do want to show you the lunge trap. So the lunge trap is another animated object, similar to the pendulum. Same principles. It's got a respawn point, or a respawn trigger, a respawn point, and we've got animated objects that if we touch, in this instance, if we touch the spikes, we're also going to respawn. It's also utilizing the Mono Warp in order to facilitate the respawn functionality. So let me jump on it while it's down. Let me jump on it while it's down, and then when it pops up, I respawn again. So there we go. We got respawn, we've got animated interactivity elements, and moving right along, we mentioned checkpoints. So oftentimes when you respawn at a game, you're going to respawn at the last checkpoint that you reached. Sometimes we actually want to let the player know that, hey, you've passed this and that checkpoint or whatever. So this is just to demonstrate. In this instance, we're using our yellow object as the trigger, and when I walk up to it, it just basically reveals another object that just lets us know you passed checkpoint 1. Now that basic interaction, as I mentioned, a lot of interaction boils down to a trigger object that triggers an animation either on itself or another object or both. That basic interaction can be repurposed for so many different use cases. So for example, using that same logic, we created a cutscene. The yellow object right here basically represents the camera. That's the camera position. And the semi-transparent bluish box rectangle is in essence our area that triggers the camera on. So again, it's a trigger and an animation, and walking through this object triggers the camera to turn on via animation. So you could imagine if this was a particular scene where the character's having to jump really high or do something in particular that's special or whatever, we might want to create a cutscene for that particular event. But again, it's using those very same basic principles, just repurposed, and that's how we can use some basic interaction to facilitate all kinds of creative interactive uses. So once again, just a trigger, an animation to turn on the other object, and this time we've got checkpoint 2. Now let's go ahead and play with another toy here. This is the anti-gravity. Now I don't have it turned on right here, but if you can imagine, there is actually another semi-transparent space encompassing the top half of this fan right here. So this is the anti-gravity module. It's utilizing the PPV, Player Property Volumes tool by Mona. So for example, if I jump on it, you can see it's tweaked my gravity, my jump height, and you can manipulate some of those parameters to get the kind of effect you want. The PPV tool, Player Property Volumes, also allows you to manipulate the speed of the player when they run. So using a combination of the basic trigger animation sort of principles and incorporating the player property volumes is how I've been able to create the super jump power up and the super run power up. So for example, we've got our object here that's going to be the initial trigger object, which is going to turn on this box. So that box is the player property volumes, but it's deactivated at the moment. Although you can see it, it's just there as a reference point so we can communicate about it and you know that it exists. But if I walk into the object, it's going to trigger, the power-up is going to trigger an animation on itself, and then it also has an animation on the box to turn on the collider so the space becomes alive as an area for the super jump to happen. So for example, I walk into the power-up, it triggers an animation, and it also turned on the collider for the player property volumes, so now this space is activated for a super jump. Now we've got this one set up so that when I walk out of that player property volumes box, it turns it off, the superpower is gone. And then here we've got the same player property volumes tool from Mona utilized for the anti-gravity and the super jump. So again, it manipulates gravity, physics, and also the run speed of the player. So same principle, I walk to the object, it triggers animation on itself. It also turned on the super run player property volumes object down here. So now, you know what, I need to turn that speed up a little bit higher. Oh, that went by too quick and turned off, but anyway, you get the idea. You can play with that yourself. I should make this runway a little bit longer perhaps, but anyhow. So and then this is just for fun and just a little addition, a little bit more visual scripting. We've added a random skybox and audio module. So by default, when you enter the space, it's going to select a random skybox from however many it is that you give it to select from, as well as random audio in the background. And I added this trigger here so that we can basically trigger the randomization. So I've only got 3 pieces of audio and 3 backgrounds, and looks like maybe I have a glitch with the audio's not turning on. Let's see. There we go. So if I jump, it initiates the trigger. Sometimes it picks the same soundtrack, the same background, because I only have 3 of each, like I mentioned. There's another really cool one here. Ooh, this one. I really like this one. But yeah, so you'll be able to drag and drop that into your space so that when a user enters the space, it'll play whatever random selection of audio that you provided, or it'll select, and it'll also select a random skybox. So yeah, there's the basics of all the different elements in this space. And just one more thing for your reference, and we'll cover this in the workshop. We've basically got some examples of the 2 different ways that we're able to create interactions with Mona. We've got the Reactor tool by Mona, and we've also got visual scripting. And in the workshop, we'll go over how to construct interactions with either one of those, as well as some of the nuances between them. So, welcome.